By 1988, this system, like Mexico as a whole, was under strain. Salinas faced a real challenger in the general election. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, son of a popular former president, who countered Salinas's free market reformism with a more traditional anti-capitalist populism. It was a close election, and Cárdenas won. But that was not how the official tally came out. Salinas became president, but now, more than any of his predecessors, he had to deliver the goods. For that, he turned to his Cambridge-trained economic team. The successes of the Salinas years were built on two crucial policy moves. First was a resolution of the debt crisis. In early 1989, its own presidential election safely passed. The U.S. government began showing some unexpected willingness to face up to unpleasant realities. It finally admitted what everyone had long known, that many savings and loan associations had been gambling with taxpayer money and needed to be shut down. Meanwhile, in a surprise speech, Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady declared that Latin America's debt could not be fully repaid, and that some kind of debt forgiveness would have to be worked out. The so-called Brady Plan was more a sentiment than an actual plan. Brady's speech emerged from bureaucratic intrigues worthy of "Yes, Minister," during which those government officials who might have had the technical expertise to put together a workable blueprint for debt relief were kept in the dark, for fear that they might raise objections. But it gave the extremely competent Mexicans the opening they needed. Within a few months, they had devised a scheme that was workable. Mexico ended up replacing much of its outstanding debt with a smaller face value of Brady bonds. The overall debt relief from Mexico's Brady deal was modest, but it represented a psychological turning point. Mexicans who had long agitated for debt repudiation were mollified by seeing the foreign bankers give up a pound of flesh. The debt faded as a domestic political issue. Meanwhile, foreign investors who had been afraid to put funds into Mexico for fear that they would be trapped there saw the deal as putting a period to that phase and became ready to put in fresh money. The interest rates that Mexico had been forced to pay to keep money from fleeing the country plunged, and because the government no longer had to pay such high interest rates on its debt, the budget deficit quickly faded away. Within a year after the Brady deal, Mexico's financial situation had been transformed. Nor was a resolution of the debt problem the only trick up Salinas's sleeve. In 1990, he astonished the world by proposing that Mexico establish free trade with the United States and Canada, which had already negotiated a free trade agreement with each other. In quantitative terms, the proposed North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, would matter less than one might have thought. The U.S. market was already fairly open to Mexican products, and the trade liberalization begun by de la Madrid had moved Mexico itself much, though not all, of the way to free trade. But like the debt reduction package, NAFTA was intended to mark a psychological turning point. By making Mexico's moves to open up to foreign goods and foreign investors not merely a domestic initiative, but part of an international treaty, Salinas hoped to make those moves irreversible, and to convince the markets that they were irreversible. He also hoped to guarantee that Mexico's opening would be reciprocated, that the United States would, in effect, assure Mexico of access to its own market in perpetuity. George H.W. Bush accepted Salinas's offer. How could he refuse? When the Mexican debt crisis struck in 1982, many in the United States feared that it would lead to a radicalization of Mexican politics, that anti-American forces, perhaps even communists, would rise in the resulting chaos. Instead, pro-American, free market types, our kind of people, had miraculously come to power and offered to take down all the old barriers. To turn them down would be a slap in the face for reform. It would be practically to invite instability and hostility in our neighbor. On compelling foreign policy grounds, then, American diplomats were enthusiastic about NAFTA. Convincing Congress turned out to be a bit harder, as we will see. But in the first flush of enthusiasm, that was not yet apparent. Instead, as the reforms in Mexico continued, as state enterprises were sold off, more import restrictions lifted, foreign investors welcomed, enthusiasm for Mexico's prospects accelerated. I personally recall talking to a group of multinational executives, heads of their company's Latin American operations, in Cancun back in March 1993. I expressed some mild reservations about the Mexican situation, some evidence that the payoff to reform was a bit disappointing. "You're the only person in this room with anything negative to say about this country," I was politely informed. And people like those in the room put their money where their mouths were. In 1993, more than $30 billion in foreign capital was invested in Mexico.